The morning Myrtle Merriweather stepped off the southbound stage in Harlow Creek, Texas. A woman at the general store leaned over a barrel of dried beans and said, with the kind of certainty reserved for gospel and weather, that Seth Maddox had buried his heart in the same grave as his wife, and that no living soul had managed to coax it out since. Myrtle heard it. She nodded politely, the way a person nods at information that does not especially concern them, tucked a loose strand of dark hair beneath her bonnet, and asked the woman where she might find a decent meal before sundown. That was the whole of it, really. She had not come to Harlow Creek to unbury anyone's heart. She had come because her cousin Delphine had written her a letter in the spring of 1878, saying that the schoolhouse in Harlow Creek had stood empty for 2 full terms, and that the town council was offering a salary and a room above the feed store to any qualified teacher willing to make the journey south from Missouri. Myrtle had been teaching the children of Jefferson County for 6 years, and she was 30 years old, and the flat sameness of her life had begun to press against her ribs in a way she could not quite name. So she had packed 2 trunks, kissed her mother's cheek, and taken the stage south. She was not running from anything particular. She was not chasing anything particular either. She was simply a woman in motion, which, in 1878, was itself a kind of quiet courage. The town of Harlow Creek was a proper West Texas town, which is to say it was sun-bleached and stubborn, planted in the red dust between 2 shallow creeks, surrounded on all sides by open range that seemed to breathe and shift like a living thing beneath the enormous sky. There was a main street, a livery, a barber shop, a saloon called the Dusty Spur, a church with a crooked steeple, a bank, and a hotel that smelled of cedar and old boot leather. The people who lived here were the kind of people who had chosen difficulty on purpose, or had been brought to it and decided to stay. Myrtle found the room above the feed store exactly as advertised. Small, high-ceilinged, with a single window that faced west and turned to copper fire every evening at sunset. She set her trunks in the corner, smoothed the quilt on the iron-frame bed, and looked out that window at the open land beyond the town's edge and felt, for the first time in a long while, genuinely curious about what came next. The schoolhouse was a 1-room building at the eastern edge of town, set back from the road behind a pair of old live oaks that dropped acorns like small, steady rain. It needed sweeping, airing, and a firm hand on its sticking front door. Myrtle gave it all 3 on her first morning, rolled up her sleeves, borrowed a broom from the widow Hatch who ran the boarding house 2 doors down, and had the place presentable before the church bell rang noon. She met the town council that afternoon, 4 men who smelled of tobacco and boot polish, and who regarded her with the particular blend of approval and uncertainty that men of that era often directed at capable women. They approved her credentials, told her school would begin the following Monday, and handed her a roster of 23 children between the ages of 6 and 14. She did not meet Seth Maddox that first week. She heard about him, though, the way you hear about weather coming in pieces, in sideways references, in the careful way people avoided the subject even as they couldn't quite help touching it. The rancher. The Maddox spread, 3 miles east of town, one of the oldest working cattle operations in the county. A man who came into town on Fridays to collect supplies and speak to no one more than necessary. A man whose wife, Clara, had died of fever 3 years prior, leaving him with a daughter named Josephine who was 8 years old and who had not been enrolled in school because, as the widow Hatch explained while pouring Myrtle a cup of coffee one evening, Seth Maddox did not believe a school in Harlow Creek was a reliable enough institution to trust with his child's education. He taught her himself, the widow Hatch said. After Clara passed, kept her close, can't entirely blame the man. Myrtle did not blame him either. She simply noted that Josephine Maddox was not on her roster and that 23 children deserved to have 24. She wrote Seth Maddox a letter. She was not bold about it, not presumptuous. She introduced herself as the new schoolteacher, expressed her hope that the school would serve the community well, and mentioned politely that she had heard his daughter was a bright girl and that an open desk awaited her whenever the family saw fit. She signed it formally, Miss Myrtle Merriweather, Harlow Creek Schoolhouse. She gave it to the postal clerk on Wednesday and thought no more about it. The following Friday, she was sweeping the schoolhouse steps in the early afternoon when she heard hoofbeats on the road and looked up to see a man on a dark bay horse, pulling to a stop at the fence gate. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, broad across the shoulders, with a face that had been outdoors long enough to carry the color and the lines of it. He wore a plain work coat and a battered hat with the brim pulled low against the afternoon sun. He had dark eyes and a jaw that had not recently made friends with a razor, and he sat the horse the way men sit horses when they have done it their whole lives and no longer need to think about it. He looked at her. She looked at him. He swung down from the horse, looped the reins over the gate post, and walked up the path. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, turned his hat in his hands once, and said, "Miss Merriweather." "Mr. Maddox," she said, because she had figured it out approximately 2 seconds after he had stopped at the fence. "You wrote me a letter," he said. "I did," she said. He looked at the schoolhouse behind her, then back at her, then at the ground between his boots for a moment. "Josephine is doing fine with what I teach her at home." "I don't doubt it," Myrtle said. "I only thought she might enjoy the company of other children her age." Something shifted in his expression, very slightly, the way a door shifts when someone puts their hand on the other side without opening it. "She has company enough," he said. Myrtle nodded. She did not argue. She did not press. She simply said, "The offer stands whenever you like. The door is open." He nodded once, put his hat back on, and walked back to his horse. He mounted in a single clean motion, gathered the reins, and rode away without looking back. The widow Hatch, who had appeared at Myrtle's elbow with the timing of a woman who had been watching from the window, said, "Well, that's more words than he's given most people in a year." Myrtle watched the dust settle behind his horse and said nothing in particular. She let it be. The school opened on Monday with 23 children and a great deal of noise and the smell of chalk dust and wood smoke from the small iron stove in the corner. Myrtle loved it immediately and completely. She loved the way the small ones gripped their slates with both hands, the way the older ones tried to appear indifferent to learning, and then couldn't help themselves when a problem caught their interest. She loved the particular silence of 23 children reading at once, a silence that was not quite silent because it breathed. She was good at her work. She had always been good at it. She moved through the room the way water moves through a landscape, finding where it needs to go, filling what is empty, working around the hard places without making a fuss. 3 weeks into the school term, a Friday afternoon in late September, she was erasing the board after the children had gone when the door opened, and a small girl came in alone. She was perhaps 8 years old, with dark hair in 2 braids and her father's eyes serious and watchful, and not unfriendly, but not yet decided. She wore a clean dress and good boots, and she stood in the doorway as if she had measured the distance and was now calculating whether the rest was worth it. "You must be Josephine," Myrtle said. "Yes, ma'am," the girl said. "Would you like to come in?" Josephine stepped inside with the careful precision of a child accustomed to making her own decisions. She looked around the room, the slates on their hooks, the readers on the shelf, the map of Texas pinned to the wall with thorough assessment. "Papa says the school might be decent," Josephine said. "He didn't say you were decent. He didn't say you weren't." "That seems fair," Myrtle said. "I'd rather earn a person's opinion than be handed one." Josephine looked at her for a long moment and then said, "He's outside." Myrtle looked through the window. Seth Maddox was at the fence again, and this time he was not alone. Beside him was a ranch hand, a young man of about 20 with a cheerful face and an expression of elaborate unconcern that meant he was paying close attention to everything. Seth himself was looking at the school with the same careful, held-back look he'd had before, as if he were doing arithmetic and not yet satisfied with the sum. Myrtle went to the door. "Mr. Maddox, would you like to come in and see the classroom?" He hesitated. The ranch hand beside him grinned and said, under his breath, something that made Seth cut him a flat look. He came in. He stood in the schoolhouse with his hat in his hands again, looking at the readers on the shelf, the globe on the corner of the teacher's desk, the problems still chalked on the sideboard. He was taller inside than he had seemed outside, which was not a rational observation, but Myrtle made it anyway. "She'd start Monday," he said at last. "Whenever suits you," Myrtle said. He looked at Josephine, who was very deliberately not looking at him and was instead examining a reader she had pulled from the shelf with an air of supreme neutrality. He looked back at Myrtle. "Monday," he said, and that was how it began. Josephine Maddox was, as advertised, a bright girl. She had been well taught by her father. Her arithmetic was solid, her reading confident, but she had been learning in silence. And the moment she was placed in a room with 23 other children, she lit up like a lamp finding oil. Within 2 weeks, she had made a particular friend in a girl named Louisa Carey, whose father ran the livery, and the two of them conducted their friendship with the focused intensity of children who have decided a thing is important. Seth Maddox brought Josephine to school each Monday morning and collected her each Friday afternoon. The other days she rode with the ranch hand whose name was Cal, and who Myrtle quickly gathered was more friend than employee to the Maddox household, or occasionally with a neighbor's wagon. But Mondays and Fridays it was Seth, and on those days Myrtle developed the habit of being at the door when the children arrived or departed, which was her ordinary habit in any case and meant nothing beyond what it was. He was not unfriendly. He was quiet in the way of a man who had learned that silence is safer than speech, who had been hurt not by cruelty but by loss, and who had reorganized himself around the hurt the way a river reorganizes around a stone. He spoke to her in short, practical sentences about Josephine's progress, asked once about a reader he'd seen his daughter carrying home, listened with genuine attention when Myrtle described the girl's particular facility with numbers. He never lingered. He always had somewhere to be. October came on with a long red sunset that lasted most of the month. The days cooled slowly, and the range grass turned the color of old honey, and the Harlow Creek cattle market opened for fall business, which brought strangers through town and filled the dusty spur and made the livery keeper's life complicated. It was at the fall market dance, held in the church hall on the third Saturday of October, that Myrtle first saw Seth Maddox outside the context of school. She had come with the widow Hatch, who danced with extraordinary enthusiasm for a woman of 61, and had been partnered through 2 reels by a very earnest young cattle buyer from San Antonio who told her about the cattle business at length. She was standing near the punch table taking a small rest when she noticed Seth across the room, standing with his back to the wall in the particular stance of a man who has come to a social event to fulfill an obligation and is now counting the minutes. He had dressed for it, at least. A clean shirt pressed, and his hat replaced by a newer one she hadn't seen before. Josephine was beside him, dressed in a white pinafore, tugging at his hand and pointing at Louisa Carey across the room, and after a moment Seth bent down, said something in the girl's ear, and watched her run off to her friend with an expression that was not quite a smile but lived in the same county as one. Then he straightened, and his eyes found Myrtle across the room, and for a moment neither of them did anything at all. She raised her cup slightly in acknowledgement. He nodded. She turned back to the widow Hatch, who was already getting to her feet for the next reel, and let the evening carry on. But she was aware of him, in the way you are aware of a fire in a room, not directly looking but present in your peripheral sense of warmth and light. She did not dance with him that evening. He did not ask. That was all right. November brought the first real cold, a blue sky cold that frosted the grass at night and made the creek run low and clear. The schoolhouse stove ran all day now, and Myrtle had organized the children into bringing wood on rotation, which they did with great ceremony and the occasional bark-related injury. She had also, by this point, begun reading aloud to the children in the last half hour of each Friday, a practice that had been met with skepticism by the oldest children and enthusiasm by everyone else, and which had produced, after 4 weeks, the result that even the skeptics were arriving early on Fridays and sitting down without being asked. She mentioned this to Seth one Friday afternoon while he waited for Josephine to collect her things. She was not sure why she mentioned it. She was in the habit, she supposed, of telling him things about Josephine because he genuinely listened, and the listening was, she admitted this to herself only quietly, something she had come to value. He said she talks about it at home, the reading. Does she? She told me last week's story was about a girl who went west by wagon train. He paused. She wanted to know if that was really how it was. I told her it was a great deal of hardship and also a great deal of sky, Myrtle said. Something in his expression shifted and she thought this time that it was closer to a smile than before. That about covers it, he said. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, that lasted a moment longer than their usual pauses. Then Josephine appeared in the doorway with her slate and her book bag, and Seth straightened from the doorframe and the moment closed. She watched them go down the path together, the big man and the small girl, Josephine chattering and swinging her book bag and Seth listening with his head tilted slightly. And Myrtle stood in the doorway with the cold November air on her face and thought nothing in particular except that the picture of the two of them against the late afternoon range was one of the most simply beautiful things she had seen in a long time. She went back inside and banked the stove for the night. It was Cal who told her about Clara, not purposefully, not in the way of someone meaning to explain a man or excuse him. It came out sideways, the way truth tends to in small towns, on a Tuesday afternoon in November when Cal had brought Josephine to school because Seth was dealing with a fence line that needed repair, and Cal had lingered to help Myrtle haul a box of new readers that had arrived by freight. "He's a good man," Cal said, setting the box down on the teacher's desk. "People in town sometimes make him sound like a puzzle to solve. He's not. He's just a man who had something real and then didn't have it anymore." Myrtle set down her end of the box. "I know," she said. "I'm not trying to solve anything, Cal." Cal looked at her with the direct, guileless attention of a 20-year-old who had not yet learned to hide his observations. "No," he said after a moment. "You're not, are you? It wasn't quite a question." "I'm just the school teacher," Myrtle said. "Yes, ma'am," Cal said and picked up his hat and went out. Myrtle looked at the box of readers and then at the open door and the November sky beyond it and thought, that is the whole truth and it is fine. Clara Maddox had died of typhoid fever in the summer of 1875. Myrtle learned this eventually from the widow Hatch, who told her in the way she told her most things matter-of-factly, without embellishment, because the widow Hatch respected facts. Clara had been 27. Josephine had been 5. Seth had been 32 and had not, by any account Myrtle heard, shown more than his minimum self in public since. He was different before, the widow Hatch said. Not that he was ever a man of many words, but there was an ease to him. He used to come into town and stay for supper sometimes, sit on the porch, talk about cattle and weather and whatever. After she died, he just drew in. She stirred her coffee. You can't blame the man. Myrtle did not blame him. She never had. She simply noted it, placed it in the part of her understanding that did not require action, and went on. December came, and with it the business of the school Christmas program, which Myrtle threw herself into with total commitment. She had the children learning 2 songs, a recitation, and a small pageant of the Nativity that she had adapted from a printed text to include more speaking parts so more children could participate. Josephine Maddox had been given the role of the innkeeper, a role that in the original text offered exactly 1 line, and which Myrtle had expanded to 3 on the logical grounds that an innkeeper had things to say. Josephine took the expansion seriously. She practiced her lines at home, apparently, because one Friday Seth arrived to collect her with a look of faint, suppressed amusement that sat on his face like a cat on a fence. When Myrtle raised her eyebrows at it, he said, "She has been practicing the innkeeper in every room of the house for a week." Myrtle laughed. It came out fully and without self-consciousness, the laugh of someone who is genuinely delighted, and Seth looked at her with the look of a man who has just heard a sound he didn't expect and doesn't quite know what to do with it. They stood in the schoolhouse doorway, and Josephine was still inside finishing her packing with the deliberate slowness of a child who knows her father is not quite ready to leave, and the December air was cold and clear and smelled of wood smoke and distant cedar. "The program is the 20th, Myrtle said. At 6 o'clock in the church hall. Every family is invited." "We'll be there," Seth said. Another pause. This one had weight to it, the weight of two people standing near each other in the cold and not finding reason to step apart. "Miss Merriweather," he said, and then stopped. She waited. "The school has been good for her," he said. "I wanted you to know that." "She's made it easy," Myrtle said. "She is a remarkable child." Something moved through his face, gratitude perhaps, or something older and more complicated than gratitude, and he said quietly, "She is." Josephine appeared behind him, book-bag over both shoulders, and the moment passed. But it stayed with Myrtle all evening, sitting with her at supper, present in the room when she read by lamplight before bed. Not as hope exactly, not as expectation. As something softer than either, the quiet pleasure of being seen by someone who was not in the habit of seeing. The Christmas program was a tremendous success, as far as the town of Harlow Creek was concerned. The children sang their songs with more volume than precision, and the nativity pageant was interrupted twice by a 6-year-old who forgot his place and had to be redirected by Myrtle in a whisper. And Josephine Maddox delivered her 3 innkeeper lines with such conviction that the audience laughed warmly, and Mrs. Carey leaned over to the widow Hatch and said she had missed a calling. Myrtle stood at the back of the hall afterward, accepting compliments from families, watching the room fill with the particular warmth of a community well pleased with itself. Josephine found her in the crowd and pressed against her side with the satisfied confidence of a successful performer, and Myrtle put her arm around the girl's shoulders and felt the easy warmth of it. She looked up and found Seth Maddox watching from across the room. He was not watching Josephine. He was watching Myrtle. The look on his face was not the held-back look, not the careful arithmetic. It was something open and brief and almost startled, as if he had turned a corner and found something there he had not expected, and did not yet know what to do with what he had found. Then Josephine turned and found him and ran to him, and he caught her and swung her up, and Myrtle turned back to the family beside her, and the evening went on. But she felt it. She held it carefully, like you hold something warm in your hands in cold weather, not tightly, just with attention. The school closed for Christmas week, and Myrtle stayed in Harlow Creek. She had considered the journey back to Missouri and decided against it, the stage roads being unreliable in December. She spent Christmas with the widow Hatch, who cooked an extravagant meal for just the two of them, and then talked about her late husband Henry for 3 hours straight in the cheerful, ungrieving way of someone who has organized her grief into good stories. On the day after Christmas, which was cold and still and brilliant, Myrtle went for a walk to clear her head. She had no particular destination. She went east out of town on the main road, past the church and the last few houses, out into the open range where the red grass stood stiff with frost, and the sky was the particular pale winter blue that Texas does better than anywhere else. She had been walking perhaps 20 minutes when she heard hoofbeats and turned. Seth Maddox pulled his horse to a stop 10 feet away. He was alone. He looked at her with what she was beginning to recognize as his habitual expression around her, that careful, calculating expression that was not unfriendly but was not yet something else. "Afternoon," he said. "Afternoon," she said. A pause. The horse breathed white into the cold air. "Josephine is at the Careys," he said, as if this explained something about why he was on this road alone. Maybe it did. "I was checking the east fence line." "This is far east for a walk," he added. "I like to walk," Myrtle said. I grew up in Missouri on a farm, and I've always needed open space when I think. What are you thinking about? He asked. The question surprised him slightly, she could tell, as if he had asked it before he'd made the decision to. She considered the question genuinely. Nothing in particular, she said. That's the point, I think. Walking until the thinking stops and you're just in the air. He was quiet for a moment. Then he dismounted, and they were standing 3 feet apart on the frozen road with the open range on both sides and the town behind them and nothing in particular ahead. I come out this way sometimes, he said. When the house gets, he paused, searching for the word. Quiet, he said at last, and she understood that he did not mean quiet in the way of peace. I'm sorry, she said, not as a platitude but as a genuine expression of understanding. He looked at her with those careful dark eyes, and she looked back without deflecting, and something between them settled not into anything new but into honesty, which was its own kind of ground. They walked back toward town together. He led the horse on the rein, and they walked at the horse's pace, which was slow and easy. They did not talk a great deal. They talked a little about the frost, about the cattle market, about a book she had mentioned once that he had, to her surprise, read. He had done a year at a college in Austin before his father died and the ranch had needed him. He did not say this with bitterness. He said it the way a man says a plain fact. At the edge of town he mounted again and tipped his hat, and she said she would see him in January for the start of the next school term, and he said he supposed she would, and they went their separate ways. The widow Hatch, who was rocking on her porch despite the cold, watched Myrtle come up the street and said nothing except, "Supper's at 6." January was a hard month. The cold deepened and the creek froze, and there were 2 blizzards in quick succession that kept school closed for a week total and drove everyone indoors to consider their choices. During the school closure, Myrtle organized herself a library from her trunks, wrote letters home to her mother, and caught up on correspondence with her cousin Delphine, who lived in Fort Worth and had opinions about everything. It was during the second blizzard that she got a knock at the door of the room above the feed store, and opened it to find Seth Maddox with snow on his hat and Josephine tucked under his arm. "The Carrie's horse threw a shoe and she can't get home," he said, nodding at Josephine, who had been spending the day with Louisa and had been caught by the storm. "I was already in town for supplies. The road east will be open by morning. I was thinking," he paused, "whether you might have room for the night." He looked briefly as though he regretted asking. "The hotel is full." Myrtle stood back from the door. "Of course," she said. "Come in." The room above the feed store was small for 3 people, but Myrtle had 2 chairs and a small iron stove and a supply of tea, and Josephine took to it with the enthusiasm of someone who has been cold and is now warm, wrapping herself in the extra quilt from the trunk and immediately locating the box of books on the floor beside the bed. Seth sat in one of the chairs and looked large and slightly out of place among her things, which were distinctly a woman's things: a small mirror, bottles of this and that on the shelf, a shawl on the chair back, in a way that he clearly noted but did not address. Myrtle made tea. She found a tin of ginger cookies from a package Delphine had sent for Christmas. She sat in the opposite chair and they watched Josephine read with the focused silence of a child who has found the right book. "She found my copy of Treasure Island," Myrtle said low. Seth looked at his daughter, then at Myrtle. "She'll be up all night," he said. "Let her," Myrtle said. He looked at her for a moment in that way he had, the looking that was thorough and direct and said more than his words. Then he looked back at his daughter. They talked quietly over their tea, while the storm pressed at the window and the stove ticked with warmth. She asked him about the ranch, and he answered fully for the first time, not in the short practical sentences she was accustomed to, but in the full, considered way of someone who loves something and has been waiting for someone to ask properly. The Maddox spread had been his father's before him and his grandfather's before that. 300 acres of West Texas that had been harder than it was generous, and that he loved with the specific devotion a person gives to things they have earned. He asked her about Missouri. She told him about her father's farm, about teaching in Jefferson County, about the particular tiredness that had settled into her in the last year or two, the feeling that she had been living her life in a single room and needed to find the door. "You found it," he said. "I did," she said, "though I wasn't sure what was on the other side." "Is it what you expected?" She thought about the schoolhouse, about Josephine's innkeeper lines, about the vast red grass under the winter sky. "It's better," she said. He turned his cup in his hands. "I'm glad you came," he said, and then looked up as if surprised he'd said it but didn't unsay it. Josephine fell asleep in the chair with Treasure Island open across her chest at around 9 o'clock. Myrtle covered her carefully with the quilt, and Seth watched with the expression of a man who finds his chest has done something without his permission. He sat in his chair on the opposite side of the stove until the storm eased enough that the sound of it changed. And then he stood and said he thought they'd be all right to find a place at the livery for the night. He reached down and lifted Josephine, quilt and all, without waking her, with the effortless practiced ease of a father. He paused at the door. He had one arm full of sleeping child and one hand on the doorframe, and he turned and looked at Myrtle one more time. "Thank you," he said. "There is nothing to thank," she said. He nodded. He went out into the cold. She stood in the doorway and listened to his boots on the stairs, and then she closed the door and stood alone in the warm room with the stove ticking and the smell of ginger cookies and something in her chest that felt like a window opening. She did not name it. She let it be. February settled in with gray skies and the occasional warm day that reminded everyone what was coming. Myrtle celebrated her 31st birthday on the 10th of February alone and in good spirits, with a slice of pie from the Harlow Creek hotel dining room and a letter from her mother who said she hoped Texas agreed with her and asked whether she had met any decent men. She had laughed at that, alone in her small room, and eaten her pie and gone to bed. The following Friday Seth came for Josephine and stayed after. It was not entirely unusual by this point for him to speak to Myrtle for a few minutes at the end of the school day on Fridays. But today, after Josephine had run to the carry wagon to discuss something of urgency with Louisa through the fence, Seth turned back to Myrtle with a slightly different quality of attention. "There's a section of fence on the north edge of the spread," he said. "I'm planning to replace it over the coming weeks. I was going to see if Cal could manage the south herd while I'm working it." A pause. "I was going to ask if you might want to see the ranch sometime. Josephine has been asking to show you her horse." The offer was given plainly, almost as if it were a logistics problem, but his eyes were not plain. "I'd like that," Myrtle said, equally plainly. "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," she said. She rode out to the Maddox spread that Saturday on a horse borrowed from the livery, a sensible gray mare who knew the East Road perfectly and required minimal direction. The ranch appeared out of the red flat land as a collection of low buildings around a central yard, a main house, 2 barns, a bunkhouse, several outbuildings, all of it solid and practical and cared for, with the kind of maintenance that spoke of pride without pretension. Josephine was waiting at the gate, which told Myrtle she had been watching from some time, and took her horse's rein and led her in with the authority of a host. Seth came out of the larger barn wiping his hands on a cloth, and there was a brief look of genuine pleasure on his face when he saw her, visible for a moment before he settled back into his quieter register. He showed her the place. He did not show it off, he was not that kind of man, but he walked her through it with the attentiveness of someone sharing something real. The horses, the south pasture where the cattle grazed in the winter, the barn with its smell of hay and horses and honest work. The kitchen garden that Clara had planted and that Seth maintained, with the slightly awkward admission that he had kept it because Josephine liked fresh vegetables, and because throwing it over seemed a greater trouble than keeping it. Josephine showed Myrtle her horse, a small pinto named Biscuit who had the knowing, patient eye of a horse that has been loved on correctly. Myrtle ran her hand along the horse's neck and said genuinely that Biscuit was a fine horse, and Josephine glowed. They ate lunch at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, with Cal joining from the bunkhouse and filling the table with cheerful, self-conscious talk that covered the silences. The kitchen was large and clean, and had the feel of a room that had once been full and was now managing on less, but managing with care. There were curtains on the windows that had been hemmed and rehemmed. There was a rocking chair near the hearth that sat with a particular stillness. After lunch, Cal took Josephine to check on a foal that had been born 2 weeks ago, and Seth and Myrtle stood on the front porch in the February sun, which was thin but present, and looked out over the yard and the flat red land beyond the fence. "You've built something good here," Myrtle said. He was quiet for a moment. "I've kept it," he said. "There's a difference." She considered that. "Sometimes keeping is harder than building," she said. He looked sideways at her. "You're easy to talk to," he said, and it sounded as if this surprised him slightly. "You're easy to be quiet with," she said, "which is rarer." He looked at her then fully with those dark eyes that had learned to measure distance but were not always sure what to do when they found none, and she looked back without flinching, and the February sun was thin and clean on both of them. "Myrtle," he said, "not Miss Merriweather, Myrtle," and it was the first time, and then he stopped. The way he sometimes stopped, not for lack of words but from the habit of swallowing them. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "I know what you are, I'm not trying to change it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "I know you're not." And that for that day was enough. Spring came to West Texas in great broad sweeps of green and the return of the mockingbirds, and with it a new energy to everything, to the range, to the school, to the town, and to the particular slow, careful thing that was happening between Myrtle Merriweather and Seth Maddox, which neither of them had named and both of them were aware of like a fire at a good distance. Warm, present, requiring attention. He had taken to calling her Myrtle consistently. She had taken to arriving at the ranch occasionally on Saturday mornings to help Josephine with her reading, which was a legitimate reason, and also a reason she did not examine too closely. Seth was always there on Saturday mornings. This was not a coincidence that required genius to identify, and they had fallen into a comfortable rhythm of shared work, separate and parallel, that occasionally coincided at the kitchen table over coffee. March brought a difficulty. 2 of Myrtle's students, brothers named Henry and Pete Dawson, had stopped coming to school. After 3 days of absence, she made inquiries and learned that their father, a struggling homesteader on the edge of town, had put them to work on the claim because he could not afford to lose their labor. Myrtle went to call on the Dawson family on a Thursday afternoon with the kind of determined calm that she brought to problems that required precision. The Dawson homestead was 4 miles from town, a modest claim on thin land. Mr. Dawson was a lean man with tired eyes who was perfectly willing to discuss the matter and not entirely willing to change anything about it, because the work needed doing and the boys were old enough. He was not a cruel man. He was a man being pinched by circumstances. Myrtle listened to all of it. Then she said, carefully, that she understood the necessity of the boy's help during planting, and that she was not there to disrupt his livelihood, and that she proposed a compromise. The boys would attend school 3 days a week and work the other 2, and she would provide them with take-home work to keep pace with their classmates. She brought with her a small package of provisions, flour, cornmeal, dried beans, that she presented as a gift from the school board, which was a slight exaggeration of the truth, but one she felt she could stand behind. Mr. Dawson looked at the provisions, then at her, then at his boots. He said he supposed that arrangement was fair. The boys were back in school the following Monday. She mentioned it to Seth that Saturday, not to impress him, but because she had been thinking about it and found it easier to think aloud near him than alone. He listened with his characteristic full attention and then said, "I have some extra flour in the barn stores. Season's end surplus, if you need it for other families." "I might," she said. "Thank you," he nodded. He got up to refill his coffee and said, without looking at her, "You didn't have to do that for the Dawson boys." "Yes, I did," Myrtle said simply. She heard him exhale something that was almost a laugh. April was warm and sweet-smelling and full of blossoms from the few trees along the creek, and in April Seth Maddox kissed Myrtle Merriweather for the first time. It was not a dramatic moment. It was, in fact, a very quiet one. He had come to help her carry a new supply of reading primers that had arrived from Austin by freight, 4 boxes, heavier than expected, from the freight office to the schoolhouse. And they had done this in 2 trips. And after the second trip they were standing in the schoolhouse with the afternoon light coming gold through the windows and the smell of new books in the air. And he had set down his boxes and turned around, and she had turned at the same moment, and they were close enough that the step between them was smaller than usual. He looked at her. She looked at him. He raised his hand and touched her face, his thumb against her cheekbone, with the careful reverence of a man touching something he is still not certain he deserves to touch. She did not move away. She tilted her face very slightly into the warmth of his hand. He kissed her, briefly and softly, and with the total sincerity of a man who does nothing halfway when he finally does it. Then he drew back and looked at her, and she saw, for the first time, what Seth Maddox looked like without the guard up, open and uncertain and real, the way a person looks at the beginning of something. "I don't know how to do this anymore," he said. "I'm not sure I was ever," he paused. "I don't want to do it wrong." "Seth," she said, and it was the first time she had called him by his first name, "you're not doing anything wrong." His hand was still on her face. He let out a long breath as if he had been holding it since approximately 1875. She laughed softly. He looked at her, startled, and then something broke open in his expression, and he laughed too, briefly and rusty, the laugh of a man who hasn't done it in a while and is surprised to find it still works. And it was the most beautiful sound she had heard in Harlow Creek. There was still the matter of the rest of the world, which in small towns takes a particular interest in private developments. Cal noticed first, or rather Cal had been noticing for some time and simply confirmed his observations, and responded by developing a new habit of finding excuses to leave the kitchen when Myrtle visited. The widow Hatch made no comment whatsoever, but began inviting Myrtle to supper less frequently on Friday evenings, which Myrtle understood as a gift. Josephine, who was 8 and not unobservant, had at some point determined that she had a view on the matter, and her view was apparently favorable, because she began manufacturing situations in which her father and her teacher were left alone together with the transparent strategy of a person who knows exactly what she is doing and is not ashamed of it. The town itself, as towns in 1878 in West Texas were inclined to do, had opinions. Some were warm. Some were cautious in the way of people who had watched Seth Maddox grieve for 3 years and did not want to see him set back. A few were the ordinary busybody variety that did not require examination. Myrtle was aware of the opinions and paid them the amount of attention they warranted, which was not very much. She had not come to Harlow Creek to meet anyone's expectations, and she was not going to start now. What she was doing was much simpler and much harder than meeting expectations. She was learning a man. Seth Maddox, close up and consistent, was a man of deep integrity and limited words, and an enormous capacity for care that had nowhere to go except his daughter and his land, and gradually, with terrible care, toward her. He was also stubborn in ways she had to learn to navigate, not argumentative stubborn but rock stubborn, the kind of stubborn that is made of conviction rather than ego and requires patience and directness in equal measure. They had in May their first proper argument. It was about Josephine. A schoolteacher from the county seat had come to Harlow Creek in May to assess the schools, and had spoken to Myrtle about Josephine's particular ability with numbers and letters, and had mentioned that there was a girls' academy in San Antonio offering places to exceptional students from frontier communities at reduced tuition, and that Josephine Maddox was exactly the kind of girl they were looking to encourage. Myrtle had told Seth about it the following Saturday with care and specificity, presenting it as information rather than advocacy. He had listened. He had been very still. And then he had said that Josephine was 8 years old and San Antonio was 300 miles away, and the answer was no. Myrtle had said, equally calmly, that the opportunity would not arise again for several years, that Josephine would need to be 12 or 13 before she could reasonably attend, and that there was no decision required now except whether to keep the possibility open. Seth had said he didn't see the point of keeping open a possibility he was certain he would close. Myrtle had said, with precision and without raising her voice, that it was not his certainty she was questioning but his reasoning, and that a man who had built his entire life on the principle of keeping his options open might consider applying that principle to his daughter's future. There had been a silence. Seth had looked at her with an expression that had a great deal in it: frustration, recognition, and the particular look of a person who has just been told something accurate that they would prefer were inaccurate. Then he had said, "I'll think about it," which from Seth Maddox, Myrtle had learned, was a significant concession. They had not spoken of it again for a week. When they did, Seth said that he had thought about it, and that he supposed there was no harm in knowing more, and that if Josephine herself showed interest in a few years, they could discuss it then. He said this with the slightly stiff quality of a man who is changing a position he held firmly and is not going to make it look easy. Myrtle had said, "That's all I was asking." He had looked at her with something that might, in a softer man, have been described as sheepish. She loved him. She had known it for a while and had let herself know it without making decisions about it. The way you know the direction of a current without immediately choosing to swim in it. She loved his solidity and his stubborn integrity, and the way he listened as if listening were a skill he'd practiced. She loved the way he was with Josephine, the gentleness that he wore quietly, like a second coat under the weather-resistant exterior. She loved the fact that he had kept Clara's kitchen garden because his daughter liked fresh vegetables, and had never presented that as a grand gesture, just as a fact. She also knew, had always known, since the woman at the general store on the first day, that whatever grew between them would grow at his pace, because his pace was honest, and there was no point in honest things being rushed. In June, on a Sunday afternoon that smelled of hay and warm earth, they sat on the porch of the Maddox ranch house together while Josephine and Cal were somewhere in the barn disputing the ownership of a particular opinion about horses, and Seth took her hand, which he did these days with the ease of practice, and turned it over in his and looked at it as if he were reading something there. "I want you to know," he said, "that a pause." The particular pause of Seth Maddox gathering words that are large and not used to being said out loud. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean, so when I say them they are meant." "I know," she said. "I love you," he said, simple, direct. In the voice of someone who has waited until he was entirely sure and is now entirely sure. She turned to look at him. The summer evening light was on his face, and he looked back at her, open and steady and real. "I love you, Seth," she said. He exhaled. He lifted their joined hands and pressed the back of her hand to his jaw, a gesture so simple and complete that she felt the entirety of it, the weight of what it had cost him to arrive here, the patience it had taken for both of them, the strange grace of the thing that had grown between them, because neither of them had tried to force it. They sat on the porch together in the summer evening until Josephine came out of the barn and stopped when she saw them holding hands on the porch, and then turned around and went very deliberately back into the barn. Inside the barn, audible through the open door, Josephine said to Cal, "I believe my plan is working." Cal said, "Josephine, you've been doing this since November." "Good things take time," Josephine said, with the wisdom of someone who has been 8 years old for several months. Seth looked at Myrtle. Myrtle pressed her lips together to contain the laughter and mostly succeeded. July was full and warm and present, a month that seemed to have decided to be exactly what a summer month should be, generous with light and heat and long evenings. The school had closed for summer recess, which gave Myrtle time that she spent in 3 ways: catching up on reading, helping the widow Hatch with her vegetable garden, and spending 2 or 3 afternoons a week at the Maddox Ranch, where the line between visiting and belonging had blurred so gradually that she was no longer certain which side she was on. Seth did not seem uncertain. He had reached his certainty, as he reached all things, thoroughly and late, and once reached it was complete. He moved through his days with a new ease that Cal had noticed and commented on, with characteristic lack of tact, by telling Seth directly that he seemed like a human being again. Seth had told Cal to mind the south fence. It was in July that Myrtle's cousin Delphine arrived from Fort Worth for a visit, having written in June that she was coming, and that no arguments would be received. Delphine was 43, wide, loud, and constitutionally incapable of minding her own business, which she would have told you herself as a point of pride. She arrived on the Thursday stage, took in the room above the feed store, announced it was charming, and had extracted the complete situation regarding Seth Maddox from Myrtle in approximately 2 hours. A rancher, Delphine said, sitting on the bed while Myrtle sat in the chair, with a dead wife and a small child and a reputation for silence. That's one way to describe it, Myrtle said. That's the complete description, Delphine said. I'm not judging, I'm categorizing. She looked at Myrtle with the specific assessment of a woman who has known someone their whole life. You're happy. I am, Myrtle said. You've been half-happy for years, Delphine said. In Missouri, you were adequate. You were content in the way of someone who has accepted that contentment is the available option. She tilted her head. This is different. This is different, Myrtle agreed. Delphine met Seth that Saturday, at a supper Myrtle organized at the hotel dining room with the slight anxiety of introducing 2 people who each occupied a significant portion of her heart. Seth was, predictably, quiet. Delphine was, predictably, not. But what Myrtle had not anticipated was that Delphine, having satisfied her own assessment in the first 15 minutes, would settle into a genuinely comfortable conversation with Seth about cattle markets and the railroad expansion into West Texas, a topic about which Delphine knew far more than expected owing to her late husband's investments. And that Seth would listen to her with his characteristic real attention and respond with enough substance that the evening was not simply Delphine performing at him but an actual exchange. After walking Delphine back to the feed store, Delphine said, "He is exactly what you needed." "What did I need?" Myrtle asked. "Someone as real as you are," Delphine said. "Someone who doesn't use more words than necessary and means all the ones he uses." She linked her arm through Myrtle's. "When is he going to ask you to marry him?" "Delphine," Myrtle said. "I'm asking logistically," Delphine said, "so I know when to come back." Myrtle didn't have an answer. She suspected Seth was considering it. There were things in the way he looked at her sometimes, in the conversations about the ranch and its future, in the way Josephine had stopped saying, "when you visit," and started saying, "when you live here," with the casualness of someone who has already decided. But she was not pressing it, and she was not going to press it. What she and Seth had was built on the principle of not pressing things before they were ready, and she intended to honor that principle. Delphine left on Tuesday and told Seth on her way to the stage with absolute composure that she expected an invitation in due course and that she took an excellent journey if given sufficient notice. Seth watched her stage depart and then looked at Myrtle and said, "She is something." "She is everything," Myrtle said. "You get used to it." August was the hottest month, and in August the Maddox spread had its one serious difficulty of the year. A fence-line dispute with a neighboring rancher named Braddock, who had moved his cattle through a section of Maddox land without permission, and who had, when Seth raised the matter, been less than reasonable about it. It was not a violent dispute. Seth was not a man who took things to violence if a clear legal argument was available. But it required 2 weeks of careful work, a trip to the county courthouse with a land survey and a pile of documents, and a great deal of controlled patience. Myrtle watched Seth handle it with an admiration that was not about what he did, but about how he did it, methodically, without anger, with the settled authority of a man who knows his ground in every sense. He won his case, as she had expected he would, and came home from the courthouse on a Thursday afternoon with Josephine and Cal, and a look of quiet satisfaction that Myrtle met at the ranch gate. He saw her face when she came out to meet them and said, "It's settled." "I knew it would be," she said. He dismounted and stood in front of her and took both her hands and looked at her for a moment in the late afternoon light and then said, "Myrtle, I want to ask you something." Josephine and Cal, behind him, went very still and then very carefully began paying total attention to the horses. "I am not a man who does things halfway," Seth said. "I told you that. I am asking you now whether you would marry me, because you are the person I want this ranch to be for, besides Josephine, and because—" He paused. "Because I am better with you here than I have been without you, and I don't want to go back to without." She looked at him, at this man who had been told would never love again and who had loved her carefully and completely and on his own terms, and felt the full warmth of it from her chest outward. "Yes," she said. "Seth, yes." He exhaled and she felt his hands tighten around hers, and then he pulled her in and held her in a way that was not careful at all but was full and real. And Josephine, behind them, said clearly, "I told you, Cal," and Cal said, "Go tend to your horse," but he was laughing. They were married in the Harlow Creek church on the first Saturday of September, 1879, which was a clear, warm day that the whole town attended, because the whole town was inclined to, and because the widow Hatch had organized a reception in the church hall with a quantity of food that required 3 separate arrangements to source. Myrtle wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had ordered from a dressmaker in San Antonio, and her hair was done by the widow Hatch in a style that had required 45 minutes and several opinions, and she walked into that church with her hands steady and her heart entirely open, and found Seth at the altar looking at her the way he had learned to look at her in the private moments, fully, without distance. Delphine had arrived the previous Wednesday, as promised. Josephine stood at the front of the church with her hair in its braids and her best dress on, and an expression of total vindicated satisfaction, which she did not bother to conceal. Cal stood beside Seth and concentrated on not crying, with limited success. Reverend Aldens, who had performed this service many times in Harlow Creek and had long since stopped being sentimental about it, found himself pausing at the exchange of vows and looking at the two of them with the expression of a man who is seeing something real. Seth Maddox looked at Myrtle Merriweather and said the words in the voice he used when he meant something completely, and she looked at him and said them back in kind, and the church was full of people who had spent a year watching this happen from a respectful distance and who were now glad of it. They rode to the ranch together afterward in the good afternoon light, and the ranch looked different to Myrtle that day, not because it had changed, but because her relationship to it had. It was hers now, not as a place she visited, but as a place she belonged to, and the belonging settled into her like water into ground. In the kitchen that evening, after Josephine had been thoroughly kissed and put to bed, and Cal had gone to the bunkhouse with elaborate tact, Myrtle stood at the window and looked out at the dark range under the September stars, and Seth came and stood behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back into him. "Myrtle Maddox," he said low, trying it. She turned to look at him. He was smiling, a proper smile, the kind she had been learning to occasion from him over the course of a year, rare and therefore precious and absolutely genuine. She put her hand on his jaw. "Seth Maddox," she said back. He kissed her there in the kitchen with the September stars at the window and the house quiet around them, and it was the kind of kiss that says, "Here, this is where I am, this is where I intend to stay." The first year of marriage was a year of becoming, which is to say it was complicated and warm and real in equal parts. Myrtle kept her teaching, as Seth had never suggested otherwise and she had never considered otherwise, and the school at Harlow Creek continued under her direction with the particular identity it had developed, rigorous and warm, expecting much and giving equally in return. She reorganized the roster, added an older group for the children between 12 and 14 who needed advanced work, and spent a Saturday in November persuading the town council to allocate funds for a new bookshelf, which she was given after a negotiation that she later described to Seth as practice for cattle market dealings. He had laughed at that genuinely, the laugh that had become familiar and still gave her the same thing it always had. Josephine, now 9, had settled into family life with Myrtle with the ease of a child who had decided something and was now simply living it. She called her Myrtle at school because Myrtle was her teacher there, and at home she had arrived organically at Mama Myrtle after a month, which she had offered tentatively one evening at supper, and Myrtle had put down her fork and said, very steadily, that she would like that very much, and Josephine had gone back to her supper with the satisfaction of a thing resolved. Seth had looked across the table at Myrtle when this happened, and she had seen everything in his face, gratitude and love, and the quiet relief of a man who has found that life can be replenished. They found each other, also, in the particular small intimacies of shared domestic life that Myrtle had not known before. The habit of rising together in the early dark while the house was still cool, making coffee in the kitchen in comfortable silence before the day began. The particular way he woke her if she had slept past the hour, not loudly, but by setting a cup of coffee on the table beside her, and then sitting on the edge of the bed with his hand on her shoulder until she was awake enough to thank him. The evenings reading by the fire while Josephine did her schoolwork, and the way the quiet of the house had a different quality now, not the quiet of a man keeping loss at bay, but the quiet of people content in their proximity. She discovered that he had opinions about books strong, considered opinions that he expressed in the short declarative sentences he used for everything important. He had read more than she had expected, not in the way of a man performing education, but in the way of someone who had been a reader since boyhood and had never quite stopped, even under the weight of the work. They argued about Dickens on a November evening with such surprising vehemence that Cal, who had been on the porch, put his head through the door to check that nothing was wrong, and then retreated when he understood the nature of the argument, looking mildly delighted. October of that first year brought something else. Myrtle, who was not an anxious person and did not reach for hope before she had grounds for it, confirmed to herself in quiet that she was carrying a child. She told Seth on a Sunday morning while he was at the kitchen table with his coffee and his tally book, and she simply sat down across from him and said it plainly. He went very still. He put down his coffee cup. He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read too much in it, too layered, the look of a man standing at the convergence of more than one large feeling. Then he got up and came around the table and put his arms around her from behind, his face against her hair, and stayed there for a moment without speaking. "Are you all right?" he said at last. "I am very well," she said. He held her a moment longer. Then he said, his voice lower than usual, "I'm afraid." A pause. Of losing, he couldn't finish it. She took his hands where they were folded at her front. "I know," she said. "I know, but I am here and I am well and we will be careful and we will not borrow trouble before we have it." He exhaled. He pressed his lips to her hair. "All right," he said. "All right." He was, over the following months, enormously careful, not in a way that was suffocating, but in the way of a man who has paid a great price once and is applying everything he learned from it. He rode into town with her for Dr. Prentice's visits without being asked. He came in from the range at midday when he could to check on her. He did not say much about the fear. Seth did not say much about most of what he felt, but she could feel it around him like weather, and she did not dismiss it. She told him when she felt well and when she didn't, and she did not minimize either, because he needed honesty more than reassurance. Josephine received the news of the coming baby with an expression of pure theoretical interest that eventually resolved into enthusiasm, and spent several weeks compiling a list of names, of which her top candidate was something good, which she revised to William for a boy or Clara for a girl after a conversation with her father that Myrtle was not present for, but that she understood from the way both of them were at supper that evening, quiet and steady and close. The baby was born in June of 1880, on a warm morning when the windows were open and the smell of the kitchen garden came in. A boy who arrived with the kind of solid, emphatic presence that announced he intended to stay. Dr. Prentice declared mother and child in excellent health. Seth, who had been in the hallway for the duration of the birth because that was where Dr. Prentice had firmly placed him, came in afterward and stood at the side of the bed and looked at his son in Myrtle's arms with an expression so open it almost hurt to look at. He sat on the edge of the bed. He reached out one large, careful hand and touched the baby's face with the tip of one finger. "William," Myrtle said. He looked at her. She saw it pass through him, all of it, the grief and the gratitude and the love and the fear and the fact of being here, alive in this room with this woman and this child. And she held it with him, not looking away, because that was what love was. It was the willingness to hold the whole of a person. "William," he said. Josephine appeared in the doorway, having clearly been told to wait, and having reached the absolute limit of her waiting, and came in and stood on her toes to see the baby and said, "He's very small." And Seth put his arm around her and said, "So were you." And Josephine leaned against her father's side and looked at her brother with the already decided expression of someone who has found a new project. William James Maddox grew into his first year with the determination of a child who has decided that everything in the world is interesting. He was a sociable baby, easy to amuse, fascinated by the ranch with its sounds and movements and animals. He adored Cal, who adored him back with undisguised enthusiasm. He adored Josephine with the pure, uncomplicated adoration of a small child for an older sibling who has decided to be fond of him. He looked like Seth's dark eyes, the same considered expression that he wore even as an infant, as if he were assessing the situation. He looked at Myrtle, his mother, with absolute and total confidence in the world, which is perhaps the greatest thing a child can give a parent, and she held that confidence like a gift. The ranch continued and grew. Seth hired a second hand in the spring of 1881, a steady man named Elias who had experience with cattle and who integrated into the Maddox operation with minimal friction. The cattle market was good those years, the railroad having extended far enough to make transport practical, and Seth's careful management of the herd paid out in a way that let him reinvest in the property, a new north barn, improvements to the water system, a better kitchen range that Myrtle had mentioned once and found installed the following month without ceremony or commentary. The Harlow Creek school, meanwhile, grew. The 23 students of Myrtle's first year had become 31 by her third, owing to the arrival of 3 new homesteading families in the county, and the town council was discussing whether a second teacher would be needed. Myrtle thought yes and said so. The council said they would consider it. She gave them until October. In the spring of 1881, a letter arrived at the school from the San Antonio Girls' Academy. Josephine was 11 now, and the academy had a program for girls from frontier communities that offered a preliminary enrollment for exceptional students beginning at 12, with the expectation of continued enrollment at 14 for the full program. The letter was addressed to Myrtle because it had been Myrtle who had initially made the inquiry 2 years ago, and it arrived on a Tuesday and she brought it home that evening. She placed it on the kitchen table after supper while Josephine was finishing her mathematics and William was asleep. Seth looked at it. He looked at Myrtle. Then he looked at his daughter who was chewing her pencil and frowning at a fraction. "Josephine," he said, "there's a letter for you." Josephine looked up. Myrtle slid the letter across the table. The girl read it with the focused attention she gave everything important, and her face went through several things at once: surprise, excitement, and the particular constrained look of a child who is trying to manage her response in front of her father. Seth watched her. He was very still. "Do you want to go?" he said. Josephine looked at him. "You'd let me?" A pause. "I'd miss you," he said. "That's not the same as not letting you." Josephine looked at Myrtle. Myrtle said nothing because this was not her thing to manage. "I want to go," Josephine said. "I don't want to leave." She paused. "Both of those things are true." Seth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Both of those things are allowed to be true." Josephine nodded. She looked at the letter again. "Next year," she said. "Next year," he said. Myrtle looked at Seth across the table, and he looked at her, and she saw in him the full measure of what that had cost, the giving of the thing forward, the opening of the hand, and she loved him with the full, clear love of a woman who has seen a man grow. The summer of 1881 was the summer Josephine turned 12, and in the preparations for her departure in the fall for San Antonio there were shopping trips and trunk packing and letter writing. And throughout all of it Seth moved quietly and steadily, and with a particular gentleness toward his daughter that had nothing of the old holding back in it. He had been afraid once, when Clara died, to let anything be too far from his hands. He was not afraid in that way now. He let the love be as large as it was, and trusted that large love could survive distance. He was different. She had watched him become different over 3 years, not a different man, but more fully himself, the way a place becomes more itself as you come to know it. He laughed more. Not frequently. He was still Seth Maddox, and his sense of humor was dry as West Texas in August, but more. He talked more in the evenings, not for the sake of filling silence, but because he had found that he had things to say and someone who wanted to hear them. He had opinions about the cattle market and the railroad and the upcoming county election and the Dickens question, which remained unsettled. He was a man in love, is what he was, and he was no longer ashamed of it. Myrtle, in the quiet of their bedroom one September night with William sleeping down the hall and the ranch dark and settled around them, lay with her head on Seth's chest and listened to his breathing slow and said, "I never came here to fix you." He was almost asleep. He made a low sound. "I want you to know that," she said. "I didn't come to prove anything. I just came." He moved his hand, the one that was on her hair, and pressed it there more firmly. "I know," he said. "But I'm glad I did," she said. A pause, his chest rose and fell. "Myrtle," he said, "you are the best thing," he said. She was quiet for a moment, then, "You are too." The house was still. The September night was cool, and the stars were out over the Maddox ranch, and William was sleeping down the hall and Josephine was across the yard, planning her future in her sleep most likely, and Cal was in the bunkhouse and Elias was in the bunkhouse, and the horses were in the barn and the cattle were in the south pasture, and everything was where it was supposed to be. In October, Josephine left for San Antonio. Seth drove her to the stage himself. Myrtle came, and William, who did not understand what was happening, but understood that the family was together somewhere, and was therefore enthusiastic. Josephine hugged William and told him to be good and to listen to Mama Myrtle, and William pulled her braid, which was his expression of affection. She hugged Cal, who had come to town for the occasion and who managed not to embarrass himself. She hugged Myrtle and held on for an extra second. She stood in front of her father, and Seth looked at his daughter, 12 years old, dark-haired, with his eyes and something of Clara in the set of her chin and something of herself in every other part of her, and pulled her in and held her. "You right," he said. "Every week," she said. "If anything is wrong, you tell me." "I will." "You are going to be fine," he said. It was not a comfort. It was a statement of certainty, which was how Seth Maddox gave comfort. She got on the stage. She waved through the window. Seth watched the stage until it was a point in the distance, and then he looked at Myrtle, who was holding William on her hip, and she took his hand and held it. He held hers back firmly. They went home. Josephine wrote every week, as promised. Her letters were full, not in Myrtle's precise way or Seth's careful way, but in a way that was entirely her own, observational and funny and thorough. She was doing well. She had made a friend named Genevieve from Corpus Christi. Her mathematics teacher thought she had a particular gift for geometry. The food was adequate, but the library was extraordinary. Seth read every letter at the kitchen table with the same total attention he gave everything that mattered. Myrtle read them too, and occasionally wrote to Josephine separately. A teacher's letter, full of small intellectual offerings, problems to think about, books to seek out. Josephine wrote back to Myrtle with questions, and the correspondence became its own thing, a conversation between a woman and a girl that belonged to both of them. In November of 1881, the town council agreed to hire a second teacher for the Harlow Creek school. The new teacher was a young man named Mr. Farrow, fresh from a teaching college in Dallas, who arrived with extreme enthusiasm and was slightly overwhelmed by his first day, which Myrtle managed with the ease of someone who has been doing this for 8 years and remembers what the beginning felt like. She took him through everything: her systems, her methods, the way she divided the children by ability rather than age, the Friday reading aloud, the rotation for the stove wood. He was a good listener and an eager learner, and within a month was competent, and within 2 months was good. She had built something that could grow beyond her, which was the sign of a thing done right. William turned 2 in June of 1882, and Myrtle discovered in July that they were expecting again, which she told Seth in the same direct way she had the first time, over his morning coffee. This time his response was different, still affected, still carrying the old shadow of fear, but less heavy with it. He looked at her across the table and said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said, as she had said before. He nodded. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Good," he said. In March of 1883, their second child was born, a girl this time, easy and loud, who announced herself to the household and did not quiet down for several hours, which Cal said through the wall he thought was a good sign. They named her Agnes Rose, and Josephine, who had come home from San Antonio for the spring term break with the polished confidence of a young woman 2 years into her education, held her sister with the careful reverence of someone newly promoted, and took the role seriously. Agnes Rose grew into a laughing, vigorous child who was the opposite of her serious-eyed brother in almost every way, and who adored her father with a pure physical joy that had him wrapping her up and carrying her around the ranch while she pointed at things with the delighted certainty of someone who owns the world. William, 3 by the time Agnes arrived, was excellent about the whole thing. He and his sister found an equilibrium within a few months that involved Agnes trying to keep up with William and William, pretending not to mind that she was following him, and this arrangement satisfied both of them perfectly. The ranch, by 1883, was one of the well-regarded operations in the county. Seth was known as a careful and fair man to deal with, a man whose word was sufficient documentation, whose cattle were healthy and well-managed, whose land was maintained with the particular attention of someone who plans to hand it on. He had more than once helped a struggling neighbor through a difficult season: loans of feed, loans of equipment, practical assistance offered without drama and without ledger. And the county knew this about him, which is to say they knew him for what he was. Myrtle's school had become something the town was proud of. 3 of her first class of students had gone on to further education, which was not common from frontier school communities in 1883, and which the town council mentioned when discussing the school budget with a notable pride. She had organized a small reading group for adults on Tuesday evenings that met in the schoolhouse, which had grown from 6 participants to 14, and she was working on a proposal for a proper public library, which she expected would take 2 years to build and 3 years to fund, and that she was going to pursue regardless. In the evenings she came home to the ranch and the particular smell of it: wood smoke and hay and the open air, and to Seth, who was usually in from the range by the time she arrived, and who had developed the habit of having coffee ready, which was a small thing and not a small thing at all. She had been in Harlow Creek 5 years. She had come south from Missouri on the advice of a cousin with 2 trunks and no particular plan, and had built, in that time, something she had not known to specifically want. A life that was entirely hers, shared with a man who was entirely real, in a place that had decided to keep her. She was not sure, looking back, that she could have predicted any particular step of it. She had not arrived with a plan, She had not arrived to prove anything. She had simply arrived and been present and let things be what they were, and what they had become was this. October evenings on the ranch porch with Seth beside her and William and Agnes in the yard below, and a letter from Josephine on the table inside, and the red West Texas range going golden in the last light, and the knowledge, full and settled in her chest, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Seth said on one of those October evenings, watching Agnes chase a very patient barn cat across the yard while William provided critical commentary, I used to think, he paused, that this was the shape of it, just this and nothing more, managing what was left. She looked at him. I was wrong about that, he said. She put her hand on his arm. I know, she said. I'm glad you were. He looked at her with those dark eyes that had learned to be open, that had paid the price of opening and decided it was worth it. So am I, he said. Below them, Agnes cornered the barn cat and was immediately sat on by William in protest of the tactic, and both children dissolved into the particular chaos of sibling disagreement that required parental attention. And Seth and Myrtle both stood up at the same moment because that was who they were, a family, whole and particular and real, and went down the porch steps together into the last of the October light. Josephine came home from San Antonio for good at the end of the 1884 school term, having completed the academy's program at 15 with honors in mathematics and literature, carrying a small trunk of books and the polished independence of a young woman who has been shaped by a good education and knows exactly what she intends to do with it. She had, in letters over the preceding months, been discussing with Myrtle the possibility of eventually teaching herself, or perhaps studying further in time, and these letters had been some of the most intellectually alive correspondence Myrtle had received in years. She was home, and the ranch received her with the uncomplicated warmth of a place that had always known she would come back. William, 4, had the precise memory of a small child for a person who had always been important, and attached himself to his sister with total trust from the first day. Agnes, not yet 2, was less certain of this new person, but was won over by the 4th day when Josephine demonstrated that she could neigh like a horse with impressive accuracy. Seth received his daughter on the porch, and she came up the steps and into his arms the way she always had, and he held her the way he held all the things he loved completely, without reservation. You look like yourself, he said, drawing back to look at her. I am more myself, she said, with the particular assurance of 15. He laughed. He turned and looked at Myrtle, who was standing in the doorway, and his expression said all of it, the gratitude, the completeness, the full and present love of a man who had been given back his own life and had not wasted it. Myrtle smiled back. That evening at supper, the 5 of them around the big kitchen table, with the familiar sounds of the ranch at evening and the smell of food and the warm light of the lamps, Seth looked around the table at Josephine gesturing with her fork as she described San Antonio, at William cutting his food with intense concentration, at Agnes smearing something on the table with the calm determination of a small scientist, at Myrtle watching all of it with the expression she had when she was happy and not trying to contain it, and felt what he had not thought he would feel again, the specific, total fullness of a life that is everything it needs to be. He had been told, or rather the world had told him in the way the world tells men things, in looks, in the careful voices of the widow Hatch and others, in the silence that surrounded his name for 3 years, that he was done, that the heart had one of certain things in it, and his had been spent, and that was the shape of it. The world had been wrong. He looked at Myrtle and she looked back, across the table with the children between them and the lamp light warm and the October evening pressing at the window. More coffee, she said. Yes, he said. She got up to fetch it, and he watched her move around the kitchen that was hers now as much as anyone's, and felt the fullness of the evening and the fullness of the life, and thought, this is what it is. This is the whole of it, and the whole of it was enough. The whole of it was more than enough. The whole of it was everything. Outside, the West Texas night settled over the Maddox Ranch with its vast dark sky and its unimaginable number of stars. And the cattle were in the south pasture, and the horses were in the barn, and the lamps were lit, and the family was at the table. And Myrtle Merriweather Maddox set the coffee pot on the stove, and came home to her people, and stayed.